Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I guess that depends on where you are, east to west from me here in Dallas. But either way, thanks for joining. Happy New Year to everyone. As we like to do, I think it's about the 5th year in a row where we just kind of sit down and talk about what's going to come ahead of us in terms of SEC cybersecurity compliance and talk about some trends and threats and some of the things you guys should probably be doing as we head into the new year here. So my name is Brian Hahn. I'm with them Tradecraft, and essentially we're a brain trust that provides intelligence and cybersecurity consulting to a little over 200 SEC registered firms. We're completely unbiased in our consultations. We don't sell software, vendor services, cyber services, anything of that nature. We act as a pure cyber consultant. And today I want to discuss some cyber trends and threats that we're going to expect in 2024. We're going to also kind of blend in some of the evolving SEC regulatory environment, what we're seeing and what we've been talking about since about February of 2022 when that all changed. And then we'll end in a Q&A session. So everything will be recorded today and I'll distribute via email and also on our YouTube channel where all the videos go. And then as we go, as questions come up, feel free to type them into the Q&A session, or excuse me, into the Q&A window. And then during the Q&A session, I'll address them. So I think, as I talk to firms, the biggest trend of 2024 is going to be 20649 is going to be very stressful. I think people are starting to catch on to this as they see what the SEC is putting out, and they're seeing what's coming out of these examinations and what documentation is going to be requested. And, ultimately it boils down to, the expense, the expertise and the time, and how are you going to allocate to the three of those two to tackle these new regulations. And so that's, I think overall that's the biggest factor. And of course, there's a lot that feeds into that. But ultimately, 2024, I think, is when we're really going to see the SEC make sure that their recent regulations are going forth and going hard, not only in terms of RIAs, but also on the public company side where we're kind of seeing some mirror regulation. And of course, the regulation we're talking about is 20649. It's a little over 200 pages, and I'll reference it throughout our talk today. If you haven't been on top of it yet, the SEC has a great little 2-pager out here that covers a lot of what needs to be addressed in terms of 20649. Essentially it breaks down to, we have some new disclosures coming through the Form ADVs. So disclosure of risk to clients and prospects is new. We're going to have the proper implementation of a cyber hygiene and protection measures policy. So for whatever that means for your firm, each firm's a little bit different in how they're set up. Are they using Azure? Are they using AWS, Office 365, Google Workspace, whatever the flavor may be? There's going to be different hygiene and protection measures that you're going to need to have in place depending on your particular setup. We're also going to need a designated person for oversight. So there's going to have to be an executive that is brought in on all decisions and signs off on all decisions and has full oversight. So we're going to have to show that. And of course, that comes with a lot of risks that we've covered in depth in other webinars, and we'll chat about briefly today. And then, when you look into when you really dive into 20649, the SEC's estimate of cost is roughly around $23.48 a year per employee. When you read through the comments that have come through in this regulation, a lot of vendors seem to think that's a little low. To me, that seems about spot on, maybe even a little bit high in what it takes to get this done. If we look at the average SEC firm, which I think is around 8 to 9 employees now and 300 million, I could be off. It's been a little while since I looked at that statistic, but considering the average and assuming that's what the SEC came up with this 2,300 number from, I think that could be fairly accurate on there just in terms of what to expect. But if you're interested in seeing their full breakdown, I'm sure there's plenty of pages in that regulation that dive into the calculation much deeper than I have, but definitely something worth looking at. So I want to, let's talk about the actual threats that firms face, and this little graph I think came from the CISA. I can't remember. It's one of the government cybersecurity agencies that just kind of outlines the different flavors of attack that we see, and the reason these don't add up to 100% is because we often see multiple vectors or multiple angles in each attack. Phishing is by far the most popular attack angle. I would say, especially for financial institutions, the number of what they actually experience is probably higher than 71%. I think that is generally the most active channel for hackers to get in, just because most financial firms do have some base, cybersecurity plan in place or some kind of protection. So generally phishing is going to be the main channel. And then after a successful phish, if you've seen some of my hacking demonstrations, after we're in the network, the next thing we're looking for is unpatched vulnerabilities. So what systems are you running that are vulnerable and haven't been patched? Do you have Windows systems that haven't been patched? So on and so forth. So, overall, these are the type of trends and threats that we've seen in the past. And I think, going into 2024, we're going to see rise more of what I've been calling phishing GPT, where, these hackers are taking AI and making their phishing attempts much more successful. I think a good example of that was a case I worked not too long ago, helping a firm try to figure out exactly what had happened. And this was really the first case I had worked or been involved as a consultant on a firm that looked like they had had some artificial intelligence involved in the hack. Essentially, the hack went down that the firm's client had an email compromised. We're not quite sure, most likely through phishing. Through that email compromise, the hacker was able to determine that this client regularly sent wiring instructions to this firm. This client happened to be a lifelong friend of the firm owner. They'd had long-going business and a lot of wire request emails in that particular email box that they had. So the first instance we saw where hackers more than likely took that client's emails and drafted a new wire reference letter that was sent to the advisory firm, which was successful and went through. Once that was successful, the hacker kind of realized they had their hook. They had their way in. They then found a misconfigured email server for the advisory firm and started spoofing emails from the CEO to the cashier and from one of the portfolio managers. Again, replicating language and jargon that was routinely used for these transactions within the firm. And then luckily, a slight trip up actually was able to detect these second wires that were going out, and they were caught. But ultimately, this is coming. You can use artificial intelligence to scour hundreds of thousands of emails in a matter of minutes and learn the language and learn how to communicate so that it looks like you and people don't think. Ultimately, it broke down to a problem of this firm, the advisory firm that hired me to do this follow-up work. Ultimately, they had a couple breakdowns. Their first breakdown was their email wasn't correctly configured with DMARC and DKIM records. And also they failed operating procedures in verifying any new wiring instructions that had come through. So the first wire that went out successfully, was a great spoof, but ultimately that firm should have reached out whenever there were new wiring instructions. So we're going to talk about that more, but making sure you follow your policies and procedures is extremely important, because even the simplest of policies and procedures, even though they can seem monotonous and you think a client, you shouldn't reach out. I think the new phishing GPT and everything that comes with that makes it that much more important to follow your policies and procedures. The other thing that we see, and I've held longer webinars on this, and those that have tended know I'm not a fan of 20649. On the one hand, I am a fan of it because it gives us a nice set of guidelines so that we know exactly what we need to be doing to, to make our clients secure and get the document. So that's fantastic. We have clarity on that. But ultimately, the SEC has weaponized cybersecurity. So the first thing we do during an audit is what we call a CRVT report, the Cyber Risk, Vulnerability, and Threat Report. And it's essentially where we take a look at your firm from a hacker's point of view. So if a hacker decides to come after you, what systems look vulnerable? So now, during that search, what we call OSINT search, or open source intelligence search, I'm now going to be able to visit, any hacker is going to be able to visit your Form ADV Part 2A, because you're now going to have a written description of your cybersecurity policies and procedures presented to both clients and prospects. You're also now going to have the Form ADVC, which is going to be required to be filed with the SEC. I think the latest is within 4 days of any cyber incident. So, and this form has to be updated as the investigation unfolds. So, expect a few submissions of that form. And if you don't know, everything you submit to the SEC gets dumped on the back end through data dumps and Freedom of Information Act. So everything that goes to the SEC is full public record. You can pull it up. You can pull up any information that you send. So now, when a hacker is looking at your firm, they can literally pull up your written description of what you're doing for cyber defenses and for protection. And again, if you've seen my webinars where we demonstrate the hacks and we demonstrate the phishings and breaking Wi-Fi, you know that the more information we have, the more dangerous it can get, right? So, it's one of those things that the more information we have, the better we can craft an attack and be more successful with it. So it's very dangerous. And that part of the regulation is very troubling to me. We're also seeing ransomware double dipping. And this is another one that I think is going to continue. So what's happening is these hackers are ransomwaring firms. So far, I've only heard about it on the public company side of things. I haven't heard about it on the RIA side of things, just because I think this regulation hasn't matured as much as the public company. But anyway, these hackers are going out ransomwaring these companies. Maybe they get paid, maybe they don't. I think that kind of can go either way with a lot of these, and depending on how the firm responds. But maybe they get paid for that ransomware to unlock. But if they don't, they're going to the SEC, and through the SEC's anonymous whistleblower program, they're reporting these firms for non-compliance, because these firms aren't filing these requirements with the SEC once they've been breached. They're sitting on them. They're not doing anything. We've seen kind of similar behavior for firms like Redtail, for instance, when they were breached. There was really no notification to anyone. They kept it quiet. And so, that's unfortunately the status quo of what a lot of people do. And that's going to become a problem, that we'll talk about here in a second. But ultimately, this is allowing ransomware double dipping, where they're not only getting the ransomware, but they're also trying to collect the whistleblower program fees from the SEC for turning them in. So again, it really comes back to the importance of following policies and procedures, in making sure that you're doing everything that you have to, because you'll be in a lot of trouble if you aren't. The other trend that we've discussed kind of towards the end of 2023 is this executive liability trend. So we're seeing it in the language of 20649, where they're requiring an executive, not necessarily a cybersecurity expert, just any executive within the firm has to be listed as that cybersecurity expert or that cybersecurity go-to for the firm. So, the question becomes, what is the executive liability behind that? The troubling thing about this is what we've seen the SEC do to SolarWinds and the chief information officer of SolarWinds. The people familiar with this seem to think that the fraud allegation is a bit weak. How much should they have disclosed to clients? That's a tough one. I can tell you from someone who has studied extensively what the SEC has said about cybersecurity. A lot of times you have to make your own assumptions and explain them in detail in writing, or else you could be looking at fraud, right? If you don't properly disclose, if you don't properly, talk about these channels of protection, and then also do that protection, right? So, I know you guys have experienced this just in your policies and procedures on the compliance side, because I can tell you with every RIA I've been with, and with most of the hedge funds, especially the smaller ones, there's a big difference between what's written in the policies and procedures and what the day-to-day operations actually look like. And so, if you have your cybersecurity policies and procedures manual, which we're going to have, for 20649, you better make sure you're actually doing what is in that manual, or else, you can get hit with these same kind of executive liability, internal control failures, and things like that. So that's another trend that's kind of troubling. I think it's going to be interesting to see how this affects the MSP world, the managed service provider world. These are the guys that sell ongoing IT services and things like that to different companies. I can tell you their liability insurance is going to significantly increase. But anyway, this is a trend it's a little troubling, but we're definitely seeing this coming out of the SEC. And we'll need to watch it closely to see what else happens as more and more companies have to start publicly disclosing their breaches. So great, we have all these new regulations coming down, and we have a ton of threats that we have to deal with. So what do we do, and how do we organize our firm so that we can stay out of the silver handcuffs like the SolarWinds CISO? Let's start with 20649 at a very high level and just talk about some of the things that are going to be mandated, and then we'll dive into some of the ways that you can go about and create these documents. So having a written risk and threat assessment is going to be important. If you've seen our documentation that we publish, these SEC examination requests that we publish, they always ask for a written risk report or a written threat report or written risk threat assessment report. We've seen it called a couple different things, but ultimately this is just where you write out what you expect your attack angles look like. What do you look, what a hacker is going to look at your firm? What are you looking at to protect? So make sure you have those. User access rights is a big one. There's all kinds of fancy products out there for user access rights, and I can tell you most of them are a total pain in the butt. For most of my clients, I tell them just do this on Excel. If you're less than 50 employees, there really isn't too much reason you can't do this in Excel. Down the left column, put the name of your employees. Across the top row, put the list of your systems, and then go through and fill out with the level of user access at each system and also what that entails. So does that system have access to personally identifiable information? Does it have access to custodied funds? Does it have access to cashiering functions? These are all things that you'll want to list out in there. Information protection protocols and procedures, otherwise known as a policies and procedures manual. So I haven't really seen any clarification if it matters, if it's part of your overall policies and procedures manual or if it's separate. I always create this separate for my clients just for ease of editing's sake, but I don't think either way is right or wrong. So whatever fits you best, but we definitely have to have a written policies and procedures manual. And I think on the next slide here, I'll dive into that more in detail and what has to be involved in that policies and procedures manual, which is kind of the interesting thing about 20649. It actually lists this stuff out of what we need to be putting in there. So vulnerability scanning and penetration testing. This is another one where, we have to kind of walk through with each client and really figure out what they need. One of the big problems that you may have heard me talk about is the SEC interchanges these terms vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, especially prior to 20649 and the OC releases. And in my world, in the cybersecurity world and in the consulting world, these are two very different things with two very different price points and time of engagements. And I won't get into the nitty gritty, but ultimately the way I break it down, if you don't have custody of funds on your ADV, and I'm not concerned about kind of the technical custody for firms that have it just for billing rights and things like that. I'm talking about if you actually have custody of client funds and the ability to send these funds to a third party exists, you need to be doing the more expensive and the more invasive penetration testing. It's probably 6 to 10x the cost of a vulnerability scan, but ultimately that's the price of custody. We really need to make sure that you're doing a full penetration test versus just a vulnerability scanning, which I think is appropriate for anyone who doesn't have custody. So the financial planners, the RIAs that have all their assets at Schwab or TDA or Schwab TDA now, I guess they are. That's how we think about it and divide that. Response and recovery game plan, call that your business continuity plan or your cyber continuity plan. Kind of same thing. I don't think it matters if this is a separate document or if it's a part of your overall business continuity plan that you have or disaster recovery plan. I don't think it matters, but we definitely have to have language around a cyber response plan. And then employee security training. So, whether you do it yourself or you're using a product like KnowBe4, you have to have some kind of documentation for training. If that's something you don't have, we have a product called Fieldcraft that you can purchase on our website. It's $5 an employee, and you can get that training done pretty quickly with them. It automates the entire process. But we need to have some evidence of employee cybersecurity training where they're going through phishing training, how to properly use Wi-Fi networks. If you're in a building with RFID badges, we want to educate employees on those. So, for us, we present a host of, several hundred topics that you can pick from and find what fits for your firm. But ultimately, you have to have some kind of training in place. So let's talk about that policies and procedures manual. And just to kind of sum it up, I threw up the table of contents here, which is, generally the template that I start from when I'm writing these out. And of course, we can kind of custom craft it, but this is generally the flow I go with. Section, definitions, I start with that, the summary of a program. So just the written summary of what we're doing, what kind of systems we have in place and how we're using them. Section 3 is going to be that cybersecurity manager identification. So in this section, name them out, name their qualifications, name what they're doing in terms of that role and how they're going to manage that cybersecurity position. Threat assessment. So this is where it's going to be very different for each firm. So the way I like to structure this, because it makes it easier going forward as we rebuild these documents each year, because you have to do these, these vulnerability scans periodically. It's not a one and done thing. So in my threat assessment, what I like to do is list out things like my inventory of devices, my network maps, my list of systems containing PII or personally identifiable information. What I do in my actual document is I keep that pretty static. So I like to write about the program. I like to write what I'm doing for these things. And then anything that's dynamic, I will reference in my exhibits or an appendix. And so, for instance, I would list, okay, every month we're going to do vulnerability scans of our full network. And in my policies and procedures manual, I would write out how we do that. And then I would say, reference exhibit 1. And here is my actual scan documentation that I use to address any vulnerabilities. So that way, each time we're creating new scans or new network maps or new inventory of devices, because these things are going to change, right? Like, you switch internet providers, you hire new employees, you switch IT software, you switch MSPs, or there's a whole list of things, how this type of setup changes. And when that does, we want to be able to update this documentation as quickly and as cleanly as possible and have it organized in a fashion that we can work through. So that's always how I recommend setting it up to my clients and for them to manage it. User access rights and controls, an entire section dedicated to this. So, multi-factor authentication everywhere. There is no firm out there that has any excuse to be using any system with personally identifiable information that doesn't have multi-factor authentication in place. Two things. that system, that software, that vendor does not care about your cyber privacy or security. They got to go. And two, if you have a breach with that particular system, you're going to be dinged heavily. So there's really no excuse to have any systems without multi-factor authentication. If you do, this is where you should explain out why you have it and why you can't get rid of it. So I know those people out there with those ancient juncture CRM servers running on SQL that haven't been updated in 10 years. You need to have a very good excuse for why you're still running those kind of systems. Tech usage agreements, remote worker policies, email policies, social media policies, and mobile device management. I'll just spend a few seconds about mobile device management because the large majority of firms that I deal with have a bring your own device policy. My question to them are usually, if that employee loses that device, can you wipe it? Can you remove your firm's sensitive data from that device? If the answer is no, you can't allow your employees to use that device without enrolling it in some type of mobile device management. So, you know, going down that road, that opens up all kinds of other issues that employees generally don't like. But mobile devices are a serious issue because I promise you, your employees do extremely weird things with their cell phones. Okay. And they're doing these on cell phones that have access to firm email. Sometimes they have access to custodian data. Sometimes they have access to CRM apps. So that's a major issue that needs to be addressed. And I think every firm needs a battle plan for how they're going to deal with mobile device management. My recommendation with that is always start at 0 and then back into it from there. So, you know, really think about how many of your employees need mobile device access. And a lot of times I think you'll find that maybe they don't. You know, maybe you can remove that type of thing. But anyway, getting down the rabbit hole on that, mobile device management is, it probably should have been another trend of 2024 and had its own section in this talk. But that's going to be an issue to deal with. Section 6, defense of the firm's network. So again, you know, just talking about what you're doing in terms of protecting your network. Encryption policies, record keeping policies. By the way, we have a 5-year cybersecurity record keeping policy. Any changes, all documentation, 5 years for 20649. So making sure you have that outlined. Even down to clean desk, clear screen policies, right? If an employee gets up from their bathroom or from their desk to go to the restroom, they need to make sure they clear their screen, put in a password. You know, email defense, password management, and how you're segregating network and hardware resources. So anything you're doing for defense should be listed in this section. And this is also the section that I will generally use to craft lighter language for my regulatory filing. So what I'm putting on my form ADV Part 2A and any information that I would have to put in the form ADVC would most likely come from this section and be involved with this section. So it's one to definitely keep updated and accurate. Another section for intrusion detection. Again, that's going to be different for each firm, but you have to have some kind of monitoring going on, making sure that there's no intrusion. And then, of course, your business continuity plan. So contingencies for third-party service providers, right? What happens if you wake up tomorrow and totally just picking on a name here, you know, you find Schwab's insolvent and they had a cyber attack and you can't get into their systems. And your employees or your clients are calling you freaking out. Where's their money? What are you going to do? If you have ransomware, if you have a denial of service attack, or if you just have an overall internet power outage, you know, what are you going to do with that? I mean, thinking back to Katrina, right? That was a wake up for a lot of firms that lost internet for months and had to figure out what to do and lost cell access for months. So think through these things and make sure that you list them out in that business continuity plan. So I hope that wasn't too overwhelming. You know, there's a lot coming down the pipe with 20649. You know, I think some firms have done a lot of work getting there and really just have to refine the tips. Some firms have done no work at all. And I think there'll be a time when they have to deal with that, whether with the regulators or internally. but something that you need to take care of. This video and many others are posted on the YouTube channel, so we cover a lot of different things there. If you're interested in learning vendor due diligence or, more detail, I think we have like an hour-long video just dealing with that policies and procedures manual and the details that come with that. The cyber liability issues that are coming up, and there's probably 5 or 6 videos dealing with 20649. So, if you need more information, that's a great resource to watch some videos and listen through them, and try to learn a little bit more about them. And of course, I'm always happy to take a phone call and talk about your situation and see if there's some way I might be able to help you guys align with these new regulations. And again, each firm's different. It's just in terms of coming up with a battle plan, figuring out what you need to do to meet these regulations. Because again, for us and for our clients, there's really 2 main goals, and that's secure the network and produce that compliance documentation and operational documentation that we need for our employees and for the regulators. So if I can ever be assistance to that, please feel free to reach out on that. And definitely glad to help. Again, I'll get this wrapped up and send out a link here in an email, and any questions come up, please feel free to reach out. Thanks for joining. Again, Happy New Year to everyone, and keep a lookout. We'll have some new webinars coming down, including some based more on intelligence operations and things like that. We'll have a guest speaker coming on too, so stay tuned for that. I look forward to seeing you around. Thanks again, guys.